Paul weighed in sat down with former NRA President David Keene, who has heavily criticized Senator Ted Cruz. He spoke to our very own John Hines about it.
Thank you very much. It's good to talk to you. And I'm here with Dave Keene. He's the former president of the NRA, also the president for about 25 years of the American Conservative Union. Currently the opinion page editor of the Washington Times, also a campaign advisor to Bob Dole, H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, Mitt Romney, and
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, excuse me. How could I forget? The Gipper, yes. So, Dave Keene, I want to ask you, have you ever seen a speech like the speech that Ted Cruz gave here last night?
Well, Ted Cruz missed an incredible opportunity. He has been trying, or his campaign has been trying to sort of emulate the Reagan experience of 1976, which, like this campaign, ended up with the challenger, that being Ronald Reagan then and Ted Cruz now, with a minority of delegates, which led to an attempt to get a rule adopted which would allow the delegates to ignore the binding effect of state laws and state rules and the like. In 76, though, it was very different, because in that convention, while Gerald Ford, the incumbent president, had the votes to win, it was clear to anyone in attendance that that Ronald Reagan owned the hearts of the delegates. So if he could get that rule adopted, it was suspected that he would then win the nomination. He failed because of the power of the White House. In this case, it was very different, because Ted Cruz, while he had a group, obviously, of ideological supporters, was not the love of the delegates, so to speak. So he was trying to knit together an anti-Trump group with his supporters and others in an attempt to wrest the nomination from the frontrunner. That failed, and I think it was destined to fail, for two reasons. One, he's not Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. He's a very smart guy. He's a very conservative guy. But you could see in his speech last night, it was as if he was reading a group of talking points which had already been hit by about 6 other speakers.
It was very lawyerly, I thought.
There was no poetry, there was no music. The Reagan speech of 1976 is still remembered as the highlight of that convention. The Cruz speech this year will not be remembered in that way. Secondly, he's betting, has to be betting, this is the only logic that makes any sense, that Donald Trump will lose big time, and therefore not being associated, not being perceived as loyal won't matter. If Donald Trump wins, Ted Cruz has got a problem, and he could win. If he loses narrowly, Ted Cruz has just as big a problem, because doors will close to him all over the country, because he'll get part of the blame. So he basically went all in, pushed all the chips in the middle of the table and said, this is my bet. I think it's a bet that'll fail. I said that he's pursuing the wrong model. If he actually believes Donald Trump will lose, then the correct model is the 1964 model, in which Richard Nixon, suspecting or knowing that Barry Goldwater was going to lose, and Barry not being a particularly close friend of Richard Nixon, nevertheless led Nixon to campaign more for Goldwater than anybody else. He made more stops, he made more speeches, he did more for the candidate than anybody else, knowing that while Goldwater might lose, and probably would, that the delegates that nominated him would be back in 1968. That worked. That was a strategy that would work. The strategy that Reagan pursued would work under certain circumstances for Ronald Reagan, but not for Ted Cruz.
Will these delegates remember that night, that speech, 4 years or 8 years from now, and will they take revenge on somebody like Senator Cruz?
They will, or some of them will, because the part of the speech that is memorable is when they were almost pleading for him to endorse the candidate they came here to nominate, and he refused. So his refusal to support the candidate was obvious to everyone, and that's something that's going to be remembered. Whether Donald Trump becomes president or not, many of these people are going to be back, and they're going to remember that, and that's going to work to Ted Cruz's detriment.
I was struck by the atmosphere here in the stadium, the queue. Before he spoke, there was literally Republicans dancing in the aisles. People were very excited. They wanted to be unified. They wanted to hear an uplifting, positive speech. They were so ready for it. And I think that's what really upset a lot of people.
Well, he didn't know how to read his audience. He has a tin ear, basically, for that sort of thing. Republicans and conservatives throughout the campaign and at this convention want to like Ted Cruz. But throughout the campaign and, more importantly, at this convention, he makes that very difficult. And as a consequence, it was a huge letdown. Even had he not planned during that speech to make the endorsement that they expected, the reaction of the crowd, the way he was received, he should have been able to read the expectations of the delegates. He certainly should have been able to read it when they started shouting and pleading with him to do it, and he should have done it. Because either he's going to go through this campaign adamantly refusing to support the candidate, or at some point he's going to have to do it. And if he's going to have to do it, the time to have done it was last night. Not next week, not next month, but last night.
So if you're Donald Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, somebody I know you're familiar with, what do you do? How do you capitalize on this? What's your strategy now?
You don't do anything. You just proceed forward. You know, what we've got here in sports terms is these are the final games of spring training. The real season's about to begin. And if somebody messes up in spring training, he's not on the team in the fall. And so the Trump campaign goes forward, and really what Ted Cruz does is up to Ted Cruz.
It's interesting. I thought that the speech last night with Cruz and then the speech with Pence, I think we learned a lot about all the players here. Number one, we learned that maybe Donald Trump, give him credit, saw something in Ted Cruz on the campaign trail, and maybe the lying Ted thing was not altogether inaccurate, though exaggerated, perhaps.
Well, campaign rhetoric, it tends to be exaggerated, and as somebody said a long time ago, politics ain't beanbag. And Ted Cruz is able to dish it out, but he's not able to take it. That seems to be the lesson that one learns in watching this campaign. It always gets like this. I mean, I was in the '76 campaign when Ronald Reagan was fighting with Gerald Ford, and believe me, it was tough then. But they were both adults, and they got together, and they went on and campaigned in the fall. That isn't happening with Ted Cruz, and that's not Donald Trump's fault. That's Ted Cruz's fault and his personality. So he may have read something, but so did a lot of other folks, I think, in terms of Cruz's personality and his thin-skinnedness and his willingness to go on the attack, but his inability to take a punch.
We've talked about Ted Cruz. The other, I thought, highlight, obviously, was Governor Pence. Congressman Farenthold, who I spoke with, gave it he thought it was like an A-. I think the pundits are giving it a B. Actually, I thought it was pretty good because
it was very good.
He covered the bases. He was a little bit lyrical. He borrowed some language from Ronald Reagan, one of his famous speeches. He gave the delegates the speech that Cruz should have given, and they wanted to hear that speech. And I think, for somebody, he wants to be president too, I think. Mm-hmm. It seems to me he has positioned himself as the front runner for the nomination either 4 or 8 years from now. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. Unless the ticket of which he's a part goes down in flames badly. I don't think that's going to happen. The nature of the country is that we have a fairly evenly divided electorate.
It's too close.
So the likelihood is that either Donald Trump is going to win relatively narrowly, or Hillary Clinton's going to win relatively narrowly. Under those circumstances, Mike Pence, I thought was an excellent choice by Donald Trump, and I've known him for years. He's a solid conservative. His signature introduction was the one he used last night. I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. That's Mike Pence. He is what he is. Conservatives know it, so he solves a lot of that problem internally. He's also a guy with a long background in terms of public speaking. He was a radio talk show host. He was an effective congressman for 12 years. He's not going to mess up. He's solid philosophically.
A man of his word.
And he's very much a man of his word. And he's a man who is not going to trip and fall over his own feet during the campaign. So I think it was a great choice on Donald Trump's part. It sends a very good message to the delegates, and you're right, he did deliver the two speeches that the delegates might have hoped to come from Ted Cruz were the speech that Mike Pence delivered and the one that Don Jr. delivered. Maybe he took that from his dad and he's got to write a new one.
I think you nailed it, Dave Keene. I think you absolutely nailed it. So net, in a way, a big positive night for Donald Trump, would you say?
Absolutely. This whole convention has been, before they count the votes in November, politics is about expectations and whether one meets, falls short, or exceeds expectations. Even with the sort of sour coverage that much of the mainstream media is giving to this convention. This convention began, if you read the news and looked at television, you thought this was the meeting of a dysfunctional family that was going to end up throwing potatoes at each other during dinner. They were going to go away mad at everybody. Instead, from day one, this convention began to show signs of increasing unity. And I think these delegates are going to go home unified. It also showed that they are past the disagreements of the primaries, 99.9% of them, and they're looking at the real target, which is the Democratic nominee that they have to defeat in the fall. So I think from the standpoint of expectations, from the standpoint of what people saw on television, as well as what took place here in this hall, this stands both as a success for Donald Trump, and we might add a great success for RNC Chairman Reince Priebus, who put this together while everybody was predicting he was putting together a disaster.
In a somewhat unexpected way, yes. I think you're absolutely right. So, Dave Keene, I think that's going to be the last word. Thank you very much. That's Dave Keene, who is the editor of the opinion page of the Washington Times, also a campaign advisor to Bob Dole, George H.W. Bush, Mitt Romney, and, of course, the Gipper himself, Ronald Reagan. Back to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.